Welcome to today's webinar entitled Honoring Everyday Preferences of Nursing Home Residents, Facilitating Choice and Satisfaction. My name is Kendall Lesser, and I am the Project Manager for Ohio's Pelican program, aimed at promoting preference-based, person-centered care in Ohio's nursing homes. Before we get started with the presentation, I have a few housekeeping items to go over with you. I ask that for those of you seeking Ohio Social Work CEUs, which I believe can be transferred to nursing CEUs, to please take a moment and click on the link under the chat box and complete the form. In order to issue CEU credits, we must have a record of you signing into and out of the webinar. At the very end of the webinar, you will be asked to complete a webinar evaluation and enter the time that you exited the webinar. Please expect to receive a PDF of your CEU certificate via email within the next 2 weeks. It is very important that we have documentation of every single person who is requesting CEUs. So if multiple people are viewing this webinar on one computer, each individual person needs to sign in and out of the webinar, as well as complete the evaluation form at the very end. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please type them in the Q&A chat box, and we will answer your questions at the end of the presentation. This webinar is part of a quarterly series we host on the topic of enhancing preference-based, person-centered care in Ohio nursing homes. During these webinars, we will share our latest tip sheet resources as well as our latest research findings. As part of this series, we have had 2 webinars. Our first webinar was an introduction to the PELI, and our second was about guidelines for working with proxies when conducting PELI interviews. Links to the recordings from our previous webinars can be found in the chat box on the right of the screen. During today's webinar, we will be discussing the results from a recent study which examined the relationship between residents' perceived choice and their satisfaction with care preferences being met. We will also review some ways that nursing home providers can support and encourage nursing home residents to state their preferences and direct their care as much as possible. Now I would like to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. Dr. Kimberly Van Heidsma is an Associate Professor of Nursing at Penn State University, as well as the Director of the Program for Person-Centered Living Systems of Care and a Senior Research Scientist at the Polisher Research Institute at the Abramson Center for Jewish Life. Dr. Van Heidsma's research focuses on seeking to understand the impact of contextual issues such as the physical environment, culture of care, staff interactions, interdisciplinary team processes, and psychotherapeutic approaches on quality of life and quality of care delivery for frail seniors receiving services in long-term care settings. Our next presenter is Dr. Katie Abbott. Dr. Abbott is the Robert H. and Nancy J. Blaney Assistant Professor of Gerontology and a Scripps Gerontology Center Research Fellow at Miami University. Dr. Abbott's research and teaching focuses on preference-based, person-centered care with a special emphasis on persons with dementia. Drs. Van Heidsma and Abbott have co-authored over a dozen peer-reviewed articles related to the PELI. I will now turn it over to Dr. Abbott.
I just want to start off with the research part of this study. We recognize that nursing home culture change movement advocates for residents to be able to make choices about important aspects of their care. We also know that encouraging older adults to direct their care contributes to a sense of autonomy and maintained independence. And we know that autonomy is important for physical and psychological well-being for everyone, not just nursing home residents. But we also recognize that providing for autonomy can be challenging, especially in light of safety considerations. And in acute care settings, we find a robust relationship between patient choice and satisfaction with care. But we see there's little research to understand the relationship between perceived choice among nursing home residents and their satisfaction with care. So we saw this need to explore how residents perceive and interpret level of choice. So the purpose of our study was to examine relationships between nursing home residents' perceived choice and satisfaction with care preferences. And we took a mixed methods approach, which means we used both quantitative and qualitative data to examine this association. We wanted to understand, particularly from the voice of the nursing home resident, perceptions around choice and fulfilling everyday care preferences. We hypothesized that residents who perceived that they had greater choice in fulfilling care preferences would report higher levels of satisfaction with their care preferences being met. And we also anticipated that seeking additional responses from residents would provide further depth to understanding the relationship between level of choice and the satisfaction with care. And that's why we asked for some qualitative component. So data were derived from a parent study that developed and validated the PELI-NH, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. For this study, it was a secondary data analysis. It drew a convenient sample of 39 nursing home residents from 7 facilities in the greater Philadelphia region. And you can see we had majority nonprofit, and the number of beds ranged from 120 to 324. Residents also had MMSE scores of 22 or greater. Again, many of you are probably familiar with the nursing home, with the PELI nursing home version. If you're not, it's a 72-item inventory that assesses the importance of a range of preference domains that are listed here, and the response options are on a 4-point category from something being very important to being not important at all. So, in this particular study, what we did is we asked these residents first if a preference item was asked. So let's say, for example, how important is it to you to choose what time of day to bathe? Then we asked the residents about the amount of choice they felt they had in regard to fulfilling this particular preference. And they were given 3 options that you see here: no choice, some choice, or free choice. And then we asked them why they felt they had whatever option it was that they picked, whether it was no choice or some choice or free choice. And we wrote that down verbatim. Then we finally asked them how satisfied they were in regard to the fulfillment of their preference from not satisfied at all to mostly or completely satisfied. And to minimize our interviewee burden, each participant was asked a subset of the PELI. So we didn't ask every single person all 72 items. But in total, we had 600 item-level ratings of choice and satisfaction across these 39 residents. And you can see here sample characteristics of the 39 residents. On average, they were close to 80, the majority female, had completed high school, mostly Caucasian. The other part of the sample were African American residents, majority widowed, an average MMSE score of about 26, and a length of stay in days of a little over 600 days. All right, so when we get to the results, what did we find? First, in terms of the quantitative results, upon examining the association of residents' perceived choice and their satisfaction with preferences being met, we found items rating as having no choice were associated with the lowest levels of satisfaction. Not a huge surprise there. But what did it mean? And so when we pulled from our qualitative data, participants said that they perceived no choice as a result to predetermined routines, activities, and other aspects of care. There was a sense that various aspects of care were predetermined for a resident without their opinion or choice. So, for example, one resident explained that although she has the option to exercise, she has no choice in what exercise she could do. So her quote, "In here, they have a routine. You have to do each phase as they tell you. When I go in and tell them, I'm here for my legs, I say, I'm not here for this," and she points to her arms. "I'm not lifting weights for this." They have a routine. Before I come, they say, this is what we're going to do, end quote. So predetermined activities appeared to diminish residents' perceived choice and subsequent satisfaction with care. Similar comments indicated that residents' opinions had not been asked, integrated, or incorporated into many aspects of care, which eliminated perceived choice. Residents also cited facility policies, schedule, and regulations as critical factors impacting their perception of no choice. So residents explained that there was a lack of choice and a lack of perceived control over fundamental aspects of care, such as bathing. So, for example, one quote was, "You don't have any choice. They call the shots. You are supposed to get it twice a week, a shower," end quote. This perception of no choice was also mirrored in other activities, such as being involved with cooking and in choosing a roommate. For example, safety concerns with allowing residents to cook were paramount. So another resident quoted, "Because we have no involvement other than to watch, or to eat after it is completely finished. Residents are not allowed to prepare, and we're not allowed to cook, and not allowed to be around the oven, and not allowed to cut because they don't want anything to happen to anybody." End quote. So overall, residents who interpreted that they had no choice in various matters of care described policies characterized by limited autonomy and perceived lack of integration into various components of their care. So then going back to our quantitative data, we found that a moderate level of satisfaction was ascribed to preference items of some choice. And when we looked at the themes of some choice, these open-ended responses made by the residents we spoke to detailed this conflicted sense of choice. So common reasons for residents feeling they only had some choice in preference fulfillment included a sense of seeing their preferences as restricted and difficulty with fulfilling preference. So for example, residents perceived that although they had choices available to them, their choices were in fact constrained. So this view contributed to their perception of having only some choice with regard to specific preferences. So for example, when explaining the level of choice given to a preference for choosing what to eat, one resident explained, and I quote, "I would say some choice. They ask you, you have an option of 2 different meals. Which one do you prefer?" End quote. In other circumstances, residents perceived that they had some choice, but this choice was limited by the difficulty they experienced in fulfilling a specific preference. One participant described her ability to speak out against who is involved in care, but that it was met with resistance and lack of fulfillment. So I'm quoting her now. "At one time, I requested that staff get another aide to take care of me, and she said emphatically that no, that wasn't possible. Not in those words, but words meaning that. So you know what goes through your head. I won't ask her anymore. I will go above her if I have to go, but you do know that brings on a lot of problems for yourself." End quote. Other residents explained that their own physical limitations contributed to the difficulty associated with choosing to go to entertainment events and lessened her perceived choice. So, quote, "Because it depends on where it is and how difficult it would be for me to get there. Like somebody would have to volunteer to get me in a car and bring me back safely." So perceived choice seems to be embedded within the difficulty and effort associated with honoring various preferences. And then finally, as we hypothesized, for preference items associated with free choice, corresponding satisfaction was rated highest by residents. So that was great to see this continuity. And so with regard to why residents felt they had free choice, you guys, I think, will completely understand this. They referenced relationships with staff and open communication. So one resident explained that based on the actions of staff, he perceived free choice in the amount of privacy he has. So he quoted, "There are always people coming, but they knock first. I was trying to think about people walking in and out, but they always have something to do. I get a catheter twice a day, but they always knock. They don't just march in. I could refuse these things too. It's my privilege." End quote. In the same regard, another resident described how interactions with dining staff contributed to feelings of free choice. So she quoted, "See, the chef and I are on a first-name basis, and he has listened to me about suggestions about new foods." End quote. So residents suggested that free choice was associated with keeping open communication with staff about their preferences. So for example, one resident said, quote, "Because I'm the only one that can give that information, and no one stops me from giving it." End quote. And she was referring to her preferences. These comments, tell a story that feelings of free choice are derived from an individual choosing whether or not to communicate necessary information that would facilitate their care preferences being met. So we recognize and want to state that clearly this communication is relevant for those residents who are able to communicate, and that's a limitation of our study. We spoke to residents who could communicate with us, and we recognize that there's a large proportion of residents who are unable to do that. And one of the other webinars we've done in the past talks about engaging proxies, and that might be a good one to go to in terms of trying to find out some information from residents who are unable to communicate. So in terms of the takeaway overall, our findings suggest that a sound understanding of nursing home residents' perceptions of choice may be one mechanism through which to maintain residents' sense of autonomy and improve overall satisfaction with care. Satisfaction of nursing home residents is a critical indicator of success within the nursing home culture change movement and is associated with perceived level of choice. We see that now. Resident choice is a priority for nursing home residents and suggests that increasing perceptions of choice may be a valuable mechanism by which to increase resident satisfaction. And of course, having the availability to choose from satisfactory options is an important aspect of addressing restricted perceptions of choice. So findings also support the importance of asking residents what kinds of decisions they want to make for themselves and seeking their input on what some satisfactory options would be. So these findings suggest that it's critical for nursing homes to cultivate an environment wherein residents feel comfortable voicing their opinions and that staff are trained adequately to address and acknowledge the requests of residents. And when residents articulated preferences, staff response was essential to ensuring that the resident felt a sense of free choice. So one last thing that we'll say is that resident comments indicated that interactions with any staff member, even kitchen staff you heard me mention, can contribute to resident perceptions of choice. So not just the clinical staff or not just the direct care staff. So all staff can take a role in providing more choice. So again, I want to remind you to enter any questions that you might have into your chat box. And now we're going to shift over, and hopefully I can turn it over to Kimberly, who can go through the tip sheet that can be downloaded on the website at preference-based-living.com. And so Kimberly, let's see if you're able to join again.
Yes, thank you, Katie. So as Katie mentioned, the tip sheet that you see here is freely available on the Preference-Based Living website. And just to say a word about the development of this tip sheet and the many that are in this tip sheet series. First of all, they all follow the same pattern in terms of their development of the content of them. So we just heard about a research study that represents the voices of the residents who participated in this research and shared their thoughts, opinions, feelings about this topic with us, and we were able to then represent their voices in the form of the outcome of the research that Katie just reviewed. We then took this information that you just heard and put it in front of a group of members of the Pennsylvania Culture Change Coalition who worked with us to develop the practical responses, the evidence-based approaches that you see here on the tip sheet. So these tip sheets really represent a combination of the voices of the residents who have shared their knowledge through their participation in research, our research team here, and the Pennsylvania Culture Change Coalition. And we are constantly updating and revising these tip sheets as we go along and learn from the Ohio facilities that are partnering with us and moving forward this idea of preference-based care and facilitation of person-centered care. So these are not static documents. They're going to be continued to be updated as we learn from all of you on the call and other participants in this project over the next couple of years. So thanks in advance, for your help in continuing to refine the content around this. So what did we learn thus far? So first of all, one of the messages of culture change is that you have to start at the top. And this idea of cultivating a culture to ensure resident choice, here are some of the best tips that have emerged both from resident voices and provider voices around how to do that. So again, the importance of making a top-level commitment to prioritize and honor resident choice and cultivating that culture that focuses on empowering residents to voice their opinion, and ensuring that the staff are receptive and responsive and focused on attempting to fulfill that opinion or that choice to the highest extent possible. This also means investing resources and training all staff in how to do this, and that the learning itself is not one and done, that the learning has to be ongoing through various avenues. That can happen through team meetings, inviting staff to share examples of how they're meeting resident choices through within the care planning meeting itself, or perhaps within huddles. There's many different ways in which staff can be invited to share their success stories, and then, of course, the importance of celebrating that success. Other tips that were offered was promoting and understanding that residents are usually realistic in their requests. So oftentimes we'll hear things that relate to anxiety about staff saying, well, perhaps the residents will ask for things that we can't provide, or they'll be unusually demanding in terms of what they want. And again, our experience is that the vast majority of residents are quite realistic in understanding that the meeting of their preferences take place in the context of the larger community, and are not unrealistically demanding, although, of course, we have to acknowledge that there's always one or two individuals that may fit in that category, but certainly not the majority. And that the focus has to be on empowering staff to identify and overcome the obstacles to that resident choice and how the resident wishes their preference to be fulfilled. One of the consistent themes that came up throughout our discussions with providers was the success that they found in empowering the resident council to find new ways of promoting resident choice, and the key importance of making sure that the resident council is a partner in development of policies, the development of how schedules are developed within the facility, what types of activities are offered. Those types of things are really critical, but the resident council is being one of those central ways, avenues of fulfilling that. So getting down then to the nitty-gritty, what we're going to review is, again, a list of ideas that have been offered that are successful when used in facilities that are attempting to ensure the highest level of resident choice. So when using the PELI to ask residents about the preferences, one of the keys is finding a mechanism for sharing the information with the full care team. So sometimes this involves taking the actual form itself to the care planning team and using those preferences as a reminder of how to strategize about which preferences to incorporate and focus on in the care planning process itself. The systematically incorporating resident preferences and choices into care plans, for example, using I statements when discussing a problem and goal in the care planning. An example here you see on the slide is, I like having coffee with cream and sugar immediately when I wake up at 6 a.m. So within that you see, of course, the I statement, phrasing it from the resident's perspective, as well as the detail involved in giving the team enough information to be able to meet that preference. Another example is, I don't like to get dressed until I see the newspaper and have breakfast. Again, giving a very clear directive to the direct care workers in terms of what it would take to make that resident's preference and choice of how they want to live their day very clear. The importance of working in partnership with administrators, staff, residents, and families. Again, that idea that all stakeholders must be present to resolve whatever challenges and barriers you might have in meeting resident preferences, and again, various avenues of partnership in accomplishing that really is only limited by the creativity of the facility and coming up with avenues for doing that. Offering choices and activities that are meaningful to the residents, and again, the idea that what a resident prefers is a guide to even those residents that are cognitively impaired. Those previously preferred activities are likely to be the most meaningful to that person. Again, preferences can change, but we found, and this is also a part of this webinar series, that for the most part, preferences stay quite stable over time. But it is important, of course, as people become more impaired, as they progress, especially if they have a chronic debilitating condition such as dementia, is to tailor to their remaining strengths and abilities. So it may not be possible for a person who had a preference for playing baseball for that to continue, but perhaps the resident can continue to play via the Wii. Or if that's not possible, doing something like reminiscing about a baseball game might be another example of continuing to tailor to those remaining strengths and abilities and diminishing the impact of the impairments that the resident may be experiencing. Another strategy which was suggested was starting a quality assurance and performance improvement initiative to track organization-wide data about resident preferences and the extent to which they are being met. Formerly known as the Advancing Excellence Initiative and now the National Quality Initiative, does have a person-centered care tool, Excel tool, that allows organizations to take preference information and look to the extent to which the resident is satisfied with the fulfillment of those preferences. And it produces a report which clearly shows the organization which preferences are being met to the satisfaction of the residents and which are not. That type of tool is a way of using that information to drive a quality initiative where the goal would be to, of course, enhance the amount of preferences held with people in the facility to the greatest extent possible. So that tool, for example, would be something that you would find on the Preference-Based Living website as well as the National Quality Initiative. We already mentioned about the importance of inviting resident council to help prioritize option for community improvements. They can also be used in this quality improvement capacity where the residents themselves are driving which preferences are the focus of care for the community as a whole. It's been emphasized, of course, the importance of not leaving families behind in this whole process, but rather working with them in partnership to help them understand that residents drive decision-making. And so sometimes there is a conflict between the preferences of the family versus the preferences of the residents. And again, the facility's goal in that conflict is to always drive back to the importance of that the residents are the persons that are central to driving decision making, and working with families to help educate them to understand that that is the facility's goal. And again, not that their voice is not important, but that but the sense of priority is around the residents' rights. For individuals whose ability to communicate is limited, of course, we need and encourage family members to weigh in on likely preferences. And as Katie already mentioned, we do have a whole webinar dedicated to how to facilitate that. Another way of doing it is, of course, to ask staff to observe the residents' responses to the care activities themselves. And in the cases of people with very severe impairment, we may be able to see whether a preference is being met via their emotional response to a particular care activity. So, for example, if you're getting a smile or a laugh from a resident, we can infer that that preference or their choice is being honored. If we're seeing anxiety or anger or sadness, again, we can infer that we've missed the mark and that, again, there might be something that we need to do differently about addressing that person's preference or choice. I did mention before the tip of creating person-centered care huddles for staff to share positive stories and their successes in promoting resident choice. You could also create a preferences kiosk for staff using flip charts or electronic tools to communicate residents' preferences for daily living. So if your facility does have the access to an electronic medical record, that is one way of being able to quickly communicate whether to all care providers what the residents' preferences might be. Creating a process for reassessing preferences periodically is important. I did mention that we overall find that preferences are stable, but we also have found that there are circumstances under which preferences do change, and some of those examples are here. So if a person experiences depressive symptoms, pain, or anxiety, we find through our empirical work that preferences are more likely to change in that context. So if you have a resident who has experienced one of those three things, then the need for reassessing their preferences, because the preferences may indeed have changed in the context of that. So creating a process for how you're going to address that as an organization, being aware that this type of context experienced by the resident may change their preferences, and of course we want to keep our care plans completely in sync with the resident's current preference profile. And then another example offered was asking staff to bring examples of preferences that are difficult to fulfill to team meetings, and then as a group brainstorm solutions. Again, we don't want staff to feel like they're hanging out there on their own, trying to work through some of the preferences that may be particularly difficult to meet. Some examples of this might be preferences that have some risk associated with them. So, for example, a resident who wishes to eat something that in the context of having a swallowing dysfunction of some kind. Those are very difficult situations that again, require the whole team, to come together and to brainstorm solutions. There are also some resources out there, such as the Rothschild care planning approach, to help teams work through preferences that carry some degree of risk with them. And again, this type of resource are freely available and something that teams can use to help work through some of the more difficult to fulfill preferences. All right, so those are just some of the examples of what you would see on the tip sheet that we have thus far. And at this point, we want to stop and ask if there is one practice that you currently are using to facilitate resident choice that is not on the tip sheet or not something that we've brought up thus far, or any other question about anything that we've discussed thus far today.
As people are writing, we can go through some of the places where we're going to be coming up. And so you can always submit your questions to us via email, or you can give us a call. We promise that even though we're researchers and not IT people, we can use email and telephones. We also have some upcoming events where we will be presenting in person. So we'll be presenting at the ACA Activity Conference on February 3rd. We'll also be presenting at the Council on Aging, Forum on Aging, March 15th, and that'll be in Cincinnati at the Sharonville Convention Center. And in April, we're going to be presenting at the Ohio Association of Gerontology and Education Conference, and that's in Toledo. And we do have our fourth webinar of the year scheduled for Wednesday, May 17th from 1 to 2 p.m., and that one will be on engaging staff. And so again, it's we have a paper associated with it and a tip sheet that we've been working with our stakeholders on that we'll present. As we've mentioned in previous webinars, we really view this as a partnership that we want to create. We want to learn and interact with you and also share successes and stumbles with each other. And so we would be delighted to visit your organization, to hear how you've implemented the PELI and what barriers and facilitators you've encountered. That will allow us to help come up with some potential ways to remediate some of those barriers. So again, please contact Kendall by email or phone to schedule a day and time. We also have a monthly newsletter that we send out with tips. So for example, our tip of the month sheet is included in there. We also try and give you, we have Dear PELI, so when people write in and have PELI questions, we have our Dear PELI column that we write about. And so I've just posted the link for the newsletter in the chat box. If you click on that, you should be able to sign up for the newsletter. And I also posted in the chat box links to our previous two webinars, the one when you can't ask the resident, practice guidelines for asking proxies about resident preferences, and also just kind of a general overview of PELI frequently asked questions that we did in September. So please see those links. And where else can you find resources? We've talked about our preference-based-living.com website, of course, under construction. As I mentioned, researchers, not IT personnel, but we are getting some assistance and hoping that we can get a nice site up very soon. And we also have a helpline. We do want to hear from you. Please tell us what difficulties and successes you're having with implementing the PELI. We'd love to share your tips with permission, and we will help you problem solve. We do want to be a partner with you in that. And so please, again, send your comments via email, or you can call the helpline. It can even be anonymous if you wish. And so I want to stop there and thank everybody, and then turn to some questions. And I think I'm not seeing questions on my screen, but I think it also could be frozen. And so I will see, I don't know if Kendall is able to join us if she sees questions. I know that we have had some in the past questions that have come up, but let's first see if Kendall's able to join us.
Yeah. So someone asked that they're just curious how to honor residents' preferences when they feel like different staff members are going about it differently, and that sometimes one resident, if they're working with a staff person, might feel like their preferences are being honored, but another person working with a different staff person might feel like their preferences are not being met. And how do you handle that within an organization when people who work there have different opinions about how to go about honoring people's preferences?
Wow, that's an awesome question. Kimberly, do you want to take a stab at it first while I think?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to understand if the issue is that the staff have different opinions about how to fulfill a resident preferences, and I guess the first thing that comes to mind is the how how good they are at being able to have correctly ascertained whether they're meeting that resident preference. So I guess my first question would be, so which approach does the resident feel is the winner in terms of the differing approaches? And again, we can either do that by asking the resident directly. Mary does X with you, and when she gets you up in the morning, and Sally does Y. Which between those two, which do you prefer? Might be a line of questioning for the cognitively capable resident. And then again, to go back to those who are not able to verbally respond, having a person, an outside person who's not delivering care, a supervisor perhaps, or a volunteer, observe the care interaction when Mary is doing X and Sally is doing Y, and seeing which produces the most positive emotional response on the part of the resident. So again, for me, the answer to that question always comes back to the resident themselves, and whether their perception of preference fulfillment is being honored or not. Having said that, you could also have two different approaches that are equally good, and it's not unusual to have one person try one thing that works for Mary, but when Sally tries what Mary does, it doesn't work for her. So again, I think you can't go wrong with detailing a list of approaches or having multiple tools in your toolbox in terms of an understanding of if they are both equally positively impactful on the resident's satisfaction or fulfillment. Having that in multiple tools in your arsenal is not a bad thing. And I think some of the issues come down to how do you get that into a plan of care, because lots of times those ideas are shared casually, informally among staff, and getting them into the written care plan requires attention again to that process of how you're going to make sure that those little nuggets are represented from the direct care worker's experience. So I don't know if I answered the question, but those are some of my thoughts to that really, really terrific question.
All right, thanks, Kimberly. Katie, do you have anything to add?
No, I was thinking, wow, we usually get the other question, which is how do you share the information among staff members? Because oftentimes we find that, for example, a direct care worker will find a way to work with somebody, but that information doesn't get translated to the physical therapist who might benefit from knowing that information too. And so it's great that we sort of have heard from both ends on this question.
All right, thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions pop up on my end, so
I see one.
Okay.
I do see one. Do we need to re-ask the PELI questions established with changes in resident status? And so this is something where we have looked, and this will be an upcoming tip sheet that we'll talk about too. We've looked at the stability of resident preferences, and Kimberly alluded to this, where we looked 3 months. So we asked about 255 residents their preferences, and then 3 months later we went back and asked them again, and we compared to see, are they stable, are they changing, what's happening? And what we saw is a lot of stability, but what we also saw were individuals who had higher depressive symptoms, higher anxiety, had pain. Their preferences became more important to them. And so we absolutely would recommend that if there's a change in status, that you revisit the PELI items with those residents. Now, again, your organization can decide to ask all of the PELI items. If you go back to one of our earliest tip sheets where we talk about, you may decide to focus on the 16 MDS items and revisit those. You may decide to pick 10 or 12 other items that are aligned with your mission, or maybe an initiative that you're setting off. And so whatever items are of central importance, those are the ones that we would encourage you to definitely revisit with a change in status. Kimberly, what would you add?
Yeah, I think that's you actually covered the issue related to resident status. Of course, if you're looking at the MDS 3.0 Section F, that is asked on an annual basis, regardless of the resident status. So I think the process of having at least an annual check on the preferences of an individual is probably a very good practice.
Fantastic. And I'm seeing another question about, can we get copies of the slides, please? And we will post them on our website. And what we'll do is we will put a link in the next newsletter. What we'll do is we'll take the webinar and we will close caption it, and we will put it up and make it available for you, and we will include that link in our next newsletter, which will go out in early February. And so yes, we will be in touch. Please make sure you've signed up for our newsletter, or email us directly. We can absolutely do that. And then Kendall, do you see any other questions?
I'm going through, and my computer is acting up, and I'm not seeing any more questions. I want to say, since we did have issues at the beginning of the webinar, I will go ahead and post the link for signing into the webinar and repost that right now. And so the link that I just put in the chat box is to sign into the webinar. So if you miss signing into the webinar, go ahead and sign in and document the time that you logged into the webinar. And then I will put a link to sign out and complete an evaluation up in just a moment. So what I just posted in the chat box is if you needed to sign into the webinar to get social work CEUs.
Thank you, Kendall. And I think we're almost out of time. And so, again, we greatly appreciate all of you taking the time out of your day to spend a little time talking with us. What I'm going to do is I'm going to repost the initial link. People are saying they don't quite see it, so let me repost it here. And then I'll post the one to sign out, and then we will take care of your CEUs. As I mentioned, we are a lean team of 3, and we do our best and do apologize for these technical difficulties. So there's a link that hopefully you can see, and you can complete that one. And then what I'm going to do is add a link for you to sign out and complete the evaluation to get your CEUs. And again, if you have any trouble, please reach out to Kendall. She can help out. And so again, we appreciate your time, your efforts, and we appreciate all the work you do with the residents. We know you guys are the boots on the ground, and we want to help and support you as best as we can. So again, thanks everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
All right, bye.